Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan and all views respectfully stated are welcomed here. Our podcast is unique in that we blend the energy and passion of our student interns with the insights and wisdom that come from experienced professionals. Our focus is on problem solving, not finger pointing.
Welcome everyone to this edition of Allow Us to Explain. My name is Jordan Broking and I am the Director of Media here at ONC. Today we are here to discuss Juneteenth, the recently established national holiday that recognizes the abolition of slavery, a day that alludes to the dissolution of America's dark and tragic history with its African American population, but also a moment to build for a better future while enforcing the ideals of Black empowerment in America and the drive for universal freedoms regardless of race. Today we'll take the time to digress. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Joyce Dunbar, Executive Director of the website blackpast.org. Dr. Dunbar, thank you for joining us. Would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit more about yourself and your organization?
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to this show today. Blackpast.org is the largest online archive of Black history, global Black history, in fact. Established in 2007, it is the largest, it is the most representative, and it serves, I think, as a tool for all those who are curious about Black people's contribution to world history and to global civilization. I myself have only recently started in the position. I'm a historian of African and African American studies. I've taught at Ohio State and at Central State University, which is an HBCU in Ohio. So I'm very pleased and very excited to join you for this conversation today.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Dunbar. And we are also joined by two ONC interns, Devin Peters, who serves as the governance team lead, and a podcast intern. So Devin, would you mind introducing yourself first?
Yeah, of course. So Devin Peters, I am the lead for governance here at ONC. Dr. Dunbar, is great to have you with us. I took the liberty of going through blackpast.org. The extensiveness and the robustness of such things as the timeline is very engaging, and I do appreciate the contribution that the site and your efforts overall have allowed with the context for just Black history and African American studies.
Great, thank you, Devin. And will our intern also introduce herself?
Hey, so I'm a podcast intern here at ONC. I've been here since January of 2023. And I'm excited to be here and talk, more about some historical stuff. And, like Devin and Jordan, I am incredibly excited to have Joyce here from Black Past. And I can safely say my research, of the stuff I'm going to cover that site has been incredibly helpful for me. So thanks.
So, as we just said, Juneteenth is a recently established holiday, so not everyone knows about it, not everyone was taught about it, depending on where, they went to school in the country or just what was talked about with them. So just to start off this conversation, what is the history of Juneteenth? So any of our interns or a special guest could get this conversation started.
All right, let me kick off as the historian here. So, the history of Juneteenth. The Juneteenth celebrates the date, June 19th, 1865, when the Union Brigadier General Gordon Granger arrived at Galveston in Texas with approximately 2,000 troops on June 18th. On June 19th, he gave a declaration at Ashton Villa, which was the Confederate stronghold. It was the headquarters. He gave a declaration, and it was the General Declaration number 3, which informed those that were present that slavery had been abolished 2.5 years approximately earlier. So Juneteenth celebrates the date when these enslaved people in Texas found out that slavery had been abolished. Now, let me sort of add a little bit more context. People did know that the Emancipation Declaration had been made. The Declaration by Granger was just the formal statement of it. It didn't end slavery. There were 2 more states, Delaware and Kentucky, that had to ratify the 13th Amendment, and they didn't do so until December 1865. What we see is that from 1866, Black people in Texas begin to really celebrate June 19th as a day of Jubilee. And it is the consistency, it is the, we should add to that, the spread, the migration of African Americans that takes the holiday from Texas and spreads it to the West and to the northern cities as well. But Juneteenth is being celebrated in Texas and by African American communities, not just in Texas, for a very, very long time. We see the largest, in fact, Juneteenth celebration in 1836, and 46,000 people showed up in Dallas to celebrate a Black emancipation. Juneteenth follows all of the trends, all of the social trends and political transformations that we see in American society. We see that period of xenophobia in the period before the First World War that informs Black people to take Juneteenth away from public celebration, and they have it more privately. The 1950s and the 1960s, Juneteenth becomes part of the civil rights flow and conversations about equity. Sort of, you see people seeing Juneteenth and talking about Juneteenth as the realization, the fulfillment of the Emancipation Declaration and the civil rights movement, I should say, as the fulfillment of the Emancipation Declaration. 70s, Black Power, Juneteenth, assuming, inhabiting your American identity as well as your African identity. And all the way really through, we see as 1979, the first official state recognition of Juneteenth as a holiday in Texas. The 80s, the Juneteenth is really beginning to flourish in major cities. So the fact that you know, individuals may not know of it doesn't mean that it hasn't been a huge part of the cultural landscape of this country for over a century. And that the fact of the formal federal holiday being signed into law, it didn't just happen by chance. It's been, people have lobbied for this. People have, Opal Lee famously marched 2016 to get the government for a federal holiday. But I want viewers to know that this holiday has been officially recognized by Congress since 1997. In 2000, the first official national celebration of Juneteenth began. So we're behind the curve. The conversation and the movement has been in stride for a very, very long time indeed. So Juneteenth is a celebration. It is symbolically, I should say, it's a symbolic representation of the emancipation of enslaved people. But as I say, that officially happened with the Declaration, with the Emancipation Proclamation, I beg your pardon, and it really didn't end until December 1865, when all of the states ratified. But Juneteenth is our symbol. It contains it all.
Well stated, Professor. I completely agree. With my background of going through a lot of the in-depth analysis, historical analysis on the holiday, for instance, the Emancipation Proclamation was preliminarily stated September 22nd, 1863, following the Battle of Antietam, if I stand corrected, and it's just very hard to grasp the, I guess, the reach that it eventually had, but also the lack of transparency that there was at the time, just due to lack of technological advancements. It took literally 2.5 years for Gordon Granger to basically go all the way to Texas, where a lot of the Confederate, or mostly landholders, slave landholders, basically were driven out of the South due to battles, or due to parts of the Civil War, such as like Sherman's March, where they had to basically were displaced. And about 250,000 slaves, I think, were inhabited within Texas around that point in time as well. So there was a large population of individuals who were in chattel slavery. And it just is weird to grasp the fact that it took that long, per se, for it to also occur. I have a question for you, though. When it comes to this institution and also to the emancipation, would you constitute the beginning of the Civil War as the beginning of Reconstruction?
Yes, because, and I say that because so many things, a number of things had to happen in order for Black people to participate in the war. And those, and when you think about the Confiscation Act and the Militia Act, that sort of opened the way for Blacks to be able to join and fight and for their freedom. That is the beginning, or not the beginning, I should say, I see that as part of a trend that begins in the 1850s, because certainly we can say that for example, the Dred Scott ruling that says, that Black people don't have any rights that white people are supposed to recognize. And so that you begin to see, I think, questions of Black people's citizenship rights and what are we going to do with these Africans begin to emerge in the 1850s. And regardless, I think, of how many reasons that we can enumerate for the war, certainly this question of what are we going to do with these Black people, this institution, what's going to happen with them in this here political system. And so, yes, I think that those questions that are important after the Civil War have begun. They've begun to, in fact, I don't think they could arise afterwards if they had not begun to be posed, and the situations around questions of property and individuals' ownership and exercise of their own liberty, if those questions hadn't begun to arise. And I say that also because there seems to be some thinking about what are we going to do with them? That they try, in Reconstruction, that the part of Reconstruction, I think, is the government trying to figure out, how to implement some sort of transitional support. So yes, I'd agree with you, definitely.
Perfect. I have noticed from my observation, at least from most historians, they constitute it around 1863, I'd say, is usually with the emancipation, basically. But that's when you do see the Freedmen's Bureau during the Reconstruction era. That is for the welfare, economic and social programs that were established for these newly freed people. And with the dissolution of this, basically around 1877, with the basically the fall of the Reconstruction era, with the Compromise of 1877, basically we see the failure of the state more, or like I would say, with their ability to really reinforce these people into basically economic stability.
You know, effectively, the Freedmen's Bureau lasts really, actually, effectively 3 years. In 1868, Congress votes to shut it down.
With the Johnson administration, yes.
Right. And so when you think about that alone, you have, and this is why I say that it wasn't a happenstance, you know, that the end of the Civil War, that immediate, you know, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, that there has been, I want to say that I want to extend this notion of goodwill, that there is and has been and is a thinking about, you know, how are we going to stop further violence? How are we going to incorporate these people in a way that is, it does support them? White racism, and we cannot overlook just the fact that, first of all, it was emancipation really in name only. Most of these people, they had no resources. You have people who are absolutely terrified. After the rejoicing, you have no job, no money, nothing, and no power. So they effectively end up back in the positions that they were in anyway. So it's the failure, you know, is at that point in Reconstruction. You know, I mean, it's in there. It's in actually the start of it. It's in, you know, the laws that are made that have no teeth. The fact that the South gets to decide the terms of its own, you know, re-entry into the Union. It's bizarre.
No, I could agree. For the most part, at least, this is basically the trajectory that these people will go on for another 100 years until maybe their Civil Rights Act of 1964. Following this, we have the Jim Crow era. Then we have the Great Migration of around in the early 20th century, where we just see a vast majority of the Black population in the South dispersed throughout the United States for job opportunities because, yes, again, they were given a lack thereof within the South itself. So these are all the prologues basically to the contemporary situation, which is still impacted today by these things. I mean, you see this with the criminal justice system, with these impoverished neighborhoods. Like I live in Florida, so there's a disparity with the gentrification of certain areas due to the economic depreciation of these Black communities. The state itself, per se, hasn't been able to, for the last, I'd say, maybe 150 years, to properly re-institutionalize these people with a pathway of upward mobility, for the most part.
I agree. And I want to know if you see, we're back to the Freedmen's Bureau and what it sought to set up, you know, schools, helping people to resettle. Most importantly, I think they stood to assist people to ensure that they were paid their wages, right? And to effectively stand up to white employers and white exploitation. That's one of the things that the Bureau really was firm about. There were 5 areas: education, say housing, resettling, the employment and their legal status, and access, getting access to land. So land that was confiscated, that's where we're talking about creating wealth or creating the context for people to begin to grow wealth. Those are the areas in which we see the challenges for not just poor Americans, but specifically for African Americans. And it's what you say, it's in this point where the problems we have now were created. You know,
it's been a trickle down.
Absolutely. You know, was there not a law implemented to prevent, to protect African Americans, basically to shut down organizations like the Ku Klux Klan? Think part of the 15th Amendment or so. No. It's the Civil Rights Amendment 1871 that exists. They bring that into order to stop militias. That's a dead. So you just think about those things. The militia, what is the over-policing of Black bodies?
And Black codes as well. All these barriers.
And Black, indeed. So it wasn't a refusal. I think it was just not having the strength, the will after. I think we shouldn't underestimate what the Civil War took out of the country. That you've had the War of Independence, and you have this. We are forging our identity. I think it comes as a shock, the Civil War, really, to people who are ordinary people who are away from the center. I think it is a period of great crisis. And they act effectively like, well, you know, so long as Texas, so long as the South, you know, they're not causing any problems, as long as, you know, what do they say? They go along to get along. And Black rights are sacrificed because, after all, you know, they were always marginal in the first place. So, yeah.
Well, I would say, as internationally speaking, we're at a postmodern state following that of World War II. I think domestically speaking, we're in the post-Civil War era at this point. The last, I'd say, 150 years have been, relatively speaking, basically an aggregate of the repercussions of the Civil War, which we still see very much today in the neighborhoods, in the quality of over-policing, in the educational system itself. All these are basically the factors that have trickled down due to the Civil War and its impacts. And also, the thing is to acknowledge as well is the Black participation throughout going forward since like the Revolutionary War. Like, African Americans participated in the independence of the country. African Americans participated in their own emancipation, and still they were denied their rights, their natural rights per se, from the very get-go. And yes, just the Reconstruction era itself was just a failure for the most part. But going back to just the holiday itself, with the point of it, I guess, per se, is for the Black nationalism per se, or also just Black, not nationalism, but more like empowerment or recognition of the emancipation overall.
But, you know, I think Dr. Dunbar put it perfectly, where, you know, this Juneteenth holiday, you know, while it has been, you know, established and recognized for years and years, now it's really just, you know, starting to be, you know, celebrated in the community. So there should be a celebration for that. And we are starting to see some of these celebrations start to pop up more frequently in, you know, major and smaller cities. I know I'm in Buffalo right now, and there's currently a parade happening right outside for Juneteenth. So when it comes to, you know, this holiday, how is it celebrated, and how should people who maybe, you know, either they never celebrated before, or those who maybe have refrained from doing it in the past, how should it be celebrated, and how is it celebrated, you know, across the country or even globally at that?
Okay. Juneteenth has been celebrated, and it has been a huge celebration in Texas. You know, it's not
I was going to say, I did notice you shake your head at the Black nationalism part. I would actually like you to differentiate between the empowerment and then also the nationalistic viewpoint. So I'm with you
Okay,
here.
okay. So, and I want to address that in terms of the celebration of Juneteenth.
Of course.
That, you know, the early celebrations took place away from the white gaze. You know, this was a commemoration being liberated. And let's just go back, you know, as you said, Black people participated in their liberation. We had 186,000 Black soldiers fought in the Civil War for the Union. 29,000 sailors, Black sailors. 2,000, about approximately 3,000 Black men laid down their lives, died in battle. So this Juneteenth it's not a Black holiday, it is an American holiday. That we have to acknowledge that. The individual, so what was being celebrated is something that is truly historic, which is freedom that nobody could ever have anticipated at all. And when we talk about it, yes, news of the emancipation was spread. And there were many enslavers who were just like, yeah, no, forget that, get back to work. So this declaration, this final, that's it. People read, they would come together. And if you had free Black communities where you had, the population was predominantly Black, as in 1866, the celebrations were enormous. A parade, horse racing, singing, boat rides, just whatever you could, just a real celebration. 1866, 1890s, you've got some celebrations which are effectively, and let me go back. We differentiate between whether people lived in the city or they lived in Black communities. And where they lived in cities, it depends on whether or not Juneteenth falls on a weekend or a weekday. If it falls on a weekday, you go to work. Maybe the morning begins with a church service. You go to work, come back from work, the celebrations begin. There would be formerly enslaved people would speak. Can you imagine how moving the whole, you know, you have the reading of the Emancipation Declaration, you have formerly enslaved people speaking about their experiences, about how they feel about the whole day. You have singing and thanksgiving to God, you have a dinner. So those early celebrations were very much rooted in that immediate experience of freedom. They, throughout the 20th century, we've seen Juneteenth just grow and blossom, especially after so the biggest was 1936, but after the 1970s, it builds momentum. So you have a huge celebration in Houston in 1973, that kind of, I'd say that sort of catalyzes the modern sort of Juneteenth movement, where cities, parades, Juneteenth celebration, the rodeo, all of these and more are ways in which people celebrate Juneteenth. So that's to say, if you choose to have a picnic or a barbecue and you use that as an opportunity to reflect upon the fundamental questions about equality, about power, about access, about the marginalized. If you use the Juneteenth celebration as a day of internal reflection, perhaps of service, even of celebration, that's all within the bounds of what Juneteenth represents. So Juneteenth can be just fun, and Juneteenth can be solemn.
I kind of view it. I kind of view it as like a celebration of universal equality. I would say universal equality and the natural democratic rights that a citizen to that state is, just naturally given.
Devin, thank you.
Say again, sorry.
Thank you for that, because that's exactly, I believe the same as you. What you've encapsulated, I think, what Juneteenth, what we must all work for Juneteenth to be.
Agreed. I was going to say, I feel like the integration of the Black population following the post-agricultural economy of the South, leading into the more industrialized, just the industrialization of America following the latter part of the 19th century. I feel like it kind of leading towards that universal equality. I feel like the Black population's integration into the labor movement also led towards gradual increases for them receiving the fruits of their labor going into the 60s as things become they slowly regress when it comes to industrialization following, just the 50s and 60s and the dissolution of the American economy per se. But I think leading into the 60s, those 4 to 5 decades there, where there's still segregation, there's still a plight on a certain class of people, I feel like the integration of these individuals into this working class, which embodied women as well during the World War II era. We still saw women employment increase due to the lack of men in the industry. And I feel like including women too, actually, now that I think about it, going into the 60s with this progressive movement, the integration of these people into the economy just goes to show that progressivism can rise via economic participation, and also it allows for them to recognize their the value of their labor, and for them to petition for it to be recognized at a universal level.
I agree. I think also, we can't discount immigration from Europe.
I can agree with that.
Yeah,
that's best.
Yeah, the nativism and how that starts to impact the way in which African Americans perhaps are handled in the labor force, and also
their interactions with other marginalized groups, such as Italian Americans and Irish Americans and whatnot, in cities such as Boston or New York or in the upper Northeast, I'd say, for the most part.
Industrialization and urbanization, the Great Migration, right? The migration of African Americans to urban centers. And you think about in cities, you talk about the Northeast, Boston, you think about the spaces where African Americans start to create critical mass. And so there isn't, in a sense, a white public to please. Because when you come into your community, everybody looks like you, or they're working class, and there is a sympatical that it is in those communities.
I was going to say to propagate your own community locally.
Right. And so hosting Juneteenth celebrations the way that you want is possible. And not even, it's not about possibility, but it's a natural extension of your citizenship rights to celebrate what is important, even if other people don't recognize it. And I say citizenship rights, I want to come back to that term, because I think that is the challenge for Black Americans, is that the citizenship rights were never resolved. That's what I see, what the whole debate, because the fact that voter rights are back on the table. We're talking about voter suppression. It's back on the table. We're talking about African Americans having to legitimize their right to citizenship. And that is, in a sense, it's also part of the wider conversation about immigration. You know, I don't have a resolution to that. It's just that I want to put it out there that I think that we should also see that there is a citizenship question, and it's about non-white people's citizenship rights in this country, and to resolve what wasn't resolved in 1865 to 1877. To resolve that is probably the key to our debates about immigration and who is and who isn't allowed to be in this country right now. I think so. I think that's the big elephant in the room in regards to the immigration debate, is that the status of African Americans has not yet been resolved satisfactorily from the end of the Civil War.
And it's about the inclusion of these populations of marginalized groups into a sufficient economic situation per se. But I kind of want to draw back to potentially the influence Juneteenth could have in relation to internationally speaking. Like following the Civil War, we see Cuba abolition of slavery around like 1886, if I stand corrected. Also, the abolitionist movement during the United States, and maybe let's just say the 1850s to 40s, taking some inspirations from the Haitian Revolution of 1804, and potentially drawing some similarities, I guess.
Similarities between?
Just Juneteenth's influence, I guess the holiday as a whole. But also the relation that the abolitionist movement and the influences it drew from other international sources.
The Juneteenth is not, of course, only celebrated in America. It's celebrated in Africa and in Mexico, wherever enslaved people found some solace. The holiday became a part of the experience in those spaces. Juneteenth is important. It's varyingly described as America's second independence celebration. And in terms of the things that we've described about what it symbolized, the emancipation of chattel slaves after approximately 250 years of bondage. At the moment, and we're talking about the universal, the rights of man, at a period when that's really coming to the fore. So I do see that Juneteenth can be an embodiment of what you're saying, of a wider liberation.
I agree. And also I agree with the second, basically the second independence, because I mean, the Black population is around like 20%, and that is a vast population to be basically oppressed. So, and it also just serves again as just a beacon, right? As I stated, like with Cuba, just considering how much, even at that point, the American empire was gradually rising in its status. The recognition of it from like some lesser countries at the time, seeing the abolition of this institution from America, Britain as well. I'm pretty sure Great Britain had abolished slavery around 1833. So you see the transatlantic slave trade start to regress in its organization due to naval combatants basically cutting off the lines of transportation. In regards to it internationally speaking, Do you think there are any like European countries or institutions that recognize it as well? Is there a higher grade of that, or is it mainly within like African and maybe Latin American countries?
You mean Juneteenth?
Yes.
Juneteenth is a North American
Okay.
phenomenon. It's related to the North American experience of enslavement, of chattel slavery. So Liberia, the satellites. That's where we see Juneteenth celebrated. Growing up in the UK, it's not part of our vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
So my experience, and I stepped into the USA and stepped into knowledge of Juneteenth. So it is
what would be the recognition there?
In the United Kingdom.
United Kingdom, and maybe if you have any knowledge of it throughout Europe.
Well,
considering that colonialization was a key,
right.
Proxy of it.
Indeed, but when we separate. So Europe, England abolishes slave trading and then slavery, right, by 1834, and so that affects all of the colonies there. Period of the scramble for Africa follows the emancipation. So scramble for Africa is 1880s. So the European conversation is about debt, the debt that colonization left Africans with. It's about stolen resources. It's different but similar. Juneteenth is and these conversations that we're having are within the New World. So we're having a New World conversation. So we don't want to sort of muddy the waters. The debates in Europe are really about colonization. They are about slavery from the context of being in Africa and the extraction. Here, our conversation is about creating citizenship out of these people, out of the human beings that you ripped from their homeland, brought here, effectively bred to be servants. So that's what has to be reconciled. And so the debate here about, and it's interesting, Black Lives Matter and DEI conversations equally in Europe and in America. Ultimately, the outcome of both is anti-Black racism. The outcome of colonization, the outcome of slavery has been anti-Black. So what has brought people together, what has brought those conversations together is Black Lives Matter. I'd say that's where the point at which we've met and where we can now start to work together to globally dismantle these systems of oppression. But until I think, I mean, we can see sort of like in the Black Power movement of the 60s, but in this contemporary moment that we're discussing, I put Black Lives Matter at the center, and it's pulling us and pulling Juneteenth into the center so that young people in Brixton, in Frankfurt, in Paris can also look at Juneteenth as a symbol. So we're in the period of creation, I'd say.
I appreciate that outlook. I can agree. I think the BLM is probably the greatest social movement towards that, within that narrative at the moment, at least the greatest driving force per se. It might be actually, I can't think, when we talk about subsects of just issues overall, there isn't really like that much of a coalition that has organized that massively when it regards to maybe even abortion, or when it comes to labor rights. I mean, labor has been almost shot completely within the United States. So the BLM movement now, I think about as a social movement, probably is one of the most prominent forces when it comes to this, when it comes to just challenging the institution overall. And I also just bring back
It's massive.
Yes, very massive. It is. It is. And I just kind of wanted to bring back the fact that, just going back more historically, really quick, the relation of slavery in America, one of the driving forces too for the Union was to cease the expansion to the West. But they also feared that the allowance of slavery to thrive by going West in America would eventually trickle to Latin America and further on into South America as well. So it was kind of about stopping a force that could have engulfed the whole Western Hemisphere if we had allowed the American influence to basically gravitate southward.
There's a reason why it took so long for enslaved people in Texas to find out. And part of that is because of that Texas was kind of a little protected from a lot of the fighting. And so, slaveholders moved their people from Mississippi, from Georgia to Texas so that they could safeguard their property. And so that adds, I think, another layer of significance to Juneteenth and to understanding the importance of Granger making this the statement. And
the potential that it could have reached, technically, the potential.
Yes.
This is why we also had the Compromise of 1850 with California, Utah, and I think Arizona as well. So these are all factors that had been pondered at the time. But even within the industrial North, you still had state Democrats who obviously pandered to those bourbon Democrats and the Southerners, but also just Northern Republicans who pondered whether or not it was sufficient to do it for the economy, or if the natural rights should be granted to these citizens. So
for some, there's a part of me that also sees what happens in America, the debates, and as much as you, in a sense, it is a microcosm of the earlier debates in England, about the right, is it just and competitive that you have all this free labor and I have to pay for labor? How is this supportive of the economy? How is this supportive of industry when you've got industrialists in the North competing with industrialists in the South, and the guys in the South, they don't have to pay anything for their work? So it's also part of, you see that in the xenophobia when people talk about China. It's the same sort of, it's not just. Wealth unjustly earned. Yeah, I see that the parallels that, there's this negotiating between people, and I don't think that the Northerners care that much really about the condition.
They didn't initially.
No,
they didn't until the Emancipation Proclamation, and then that kind of was the catalyst to the driving force to for the Union's objective of liberty, in quotations.
Yeah, and we have to, and if we have time, there's the state, and then there's what happens on the ground. And what happens on the ground? Violence, mob violence. We see a period where anti-Black racism is just at the end of the 19th century, early 20th, just rampant. And it's interesting to me to see that a lot of anti-Black behavior and violence tends to coalesce around those periods of coming together wars. The First World War, the Second World War, where white mobs just go around just beating up people in uniforms and burning churches down. And so again, back to this, my point, and it's that citizenship rights, Black citizenship rights are contested. So much so that I see that, third generation Europeans can come and contest African American rights. And it's bizarre. And it's because of the things that we've been discussing here, and what you've been saying, Devin, about what didn't happen and what the failures of the mid to late 19th century.
History in terms of like Black history, I think a lot of people forget that, especially 60s onward, a lot of like important people within the civil rights movement were of like Caribbean descent, African descent, first, second generation, Americans. So I think it's also crucial to point out, just because I think that there's like an idea that like, immigration kind of doesn't matter in these conversations, but they do. And they've been incredibly influential all throughout, American history, especially if we're going to talk about the civil rights movement. I just want to make that note. So earlier we had talked about the sort of international influence. I believe Devin brought up Haiti and Cuba. And earlier, there was like a discussion about sort of the end of the Civil War being this great crisis in terms of like that the Confederacy was defeated after the Civil War. And so I think that kind of caused a lot of strife, and definitely a moment of pause. But anyway, I want to talk more about internationally, and I want to specifically talk about the Battle of Adwa, which was occurred in 1896, March 1st. And so, not to go super in depth, but more or less it was a battle in northern Ethiopia, wherein which led by Menelik II, who managed to gather a little over like around 100,000 troops, and across country and like ethnic lines, during a time wherein which ethnic divisions were a lot, and so gathering all of these people from all these dozens of like ethnic groups across the country, and to mobilize against the Italian forces to victory, because this was not super long after, like we had previously discussed, the Scramble of Africa, wherein which during the Berlin Conference, more or less the partitioning of Africa amongst Europe was formalized. And so Italy at the time had kind of been spreading around the Horn of Africa, and also in Libya. Also in that area of the continent. And so with that, there was, we have the colony of Eritrea, and we also have, the Italian colonization of like parts of Somalia. And so there were a lot of tensions, and which led to, again, the first Ethiopian-Italian war. So anyway, the Battle of Adwa, it was a shock to, again, a lot of European and Americans, a lot of white people, because it was sort of seen as this, how can a European power like Italy get beat by anyone in Africa, more so, like this lesser like empire, right? It was very much a shock to the system of the idea that like might is right, and also the idea of like manifest destiny, where it's like it is our right as like Europeans to go and like civilize these people, and the fact that they resisted colonization and maintained that independence, I think was a shock to Europeans, but also I think but also very influential amongst African Americans and Black people in the US and in the Americas, because again, this was like also during Jim Crow, where you like, again, race riots, mobs of like white people just sacking whole towns, where in which there was a large Black population just racism. That's why. I think you could speak more about this, Joyce, more or less kind of the start of this idea of Pan-Africanism and that kind of idea of, kind of like seeing ourselves as part of like a larger cause, so to speak.
I think that's so fascinating, because as you were talking, I thought absolutely the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, and okay, just as an aside, Italy was just unified in 1880 and they missed out. And what I found interesting is that nobody touched Abyssinia. There was such a high regard, in any case, for the history and the culture of these people, and the Italians were just like, well, no, we missed out, so we need to get our African share. And as you said, they did not realize that this was this is the court of Menelik, and the way in which they're feudal. It's a feudal court system. So each feudal lord has his army, and they could contribute all of these men and all these people to a massive cause. That catches the attention of people like W.E.B. Du Bois, when the first huge in the early 20th century, I beg your pardon, there were these huge movements, Black Pan-Africanist movements, and Ethiopia or Abyssinia was the center that pulled everybody together. But yes, the invasion, and then the second invasion in 1936. That really you've got the invasion. I think brings Ethiopia to Black people's consciousness, and this is a church-going people. And the Bible talks about looking to the east for the coming of a Black king. And it talks of Abyssinia. And then a couple of decades later, Haile Selassie is inaugurated as Emperor of Ethiopia. And he's on the cover of Time magazine, a Black man. And it shows all of the European dignitaries that go to his coronation, and all of the American dignitaries that go to his coronation. And I think that when we're talking about the internationalism, that's where you really begin to see, I think that period from 1896 to really 1936. And I want to say that there's no small part that some of that informed some African-American interest in the Second World War. That here you had, a Black king in exile. Here you had an independent Black country. Here you had a Christian country, a country in the Bible that gives us Black people, that makes us part of the Bible story. That all had to be defended. So thank you. I think that internationalism piece does begin, or it is the invasion of Abyssinia, and the way in which the forces are able to repel Italy really does raise pride in the Black diaspora.
Yeah, definitely. And with that, I think specifically when it comes to Juneteenth, even though it's an American holiday, I think both, the celebration of the Battle of Adwa, which has been a thing like for nearly 130 years at this point. I don't recall the exact year where it was like properly seen as like a state holiday, but it's something that's celebrated annually, again, for nearly 130 years. But both of those things, I think, center around the aspect of Black liberation, and specifically Black liberation and defeating of like these like larger oppressive powers. So, in Abyssinia, it was Italy, and then in the South, it was, the Confederacy. And also for both of those, I think it was interesting to sort of realize that in the near future, these same oppressive powers would use violence as revenge. And so like in the South, like you were saying in the early 1900s, there was, waves and waves of anti-Black violence and the spread of the lost cause narrative. I grew up in Maryland, but I grew up closer to DC. But I know that there are still places in Maryland up until relatively recently that still called the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression, that kind of stuff. But also with Ethiopia, it's interesting because the second, Italian invasion, which was 40 years later with Benito Mussolini, he wanted to build his Roman Empire, and like literally like the main reason why he wanted to do that was as a aspect of like revenge for losing so bad in the Battle of Adwa. And so kind of getting that revenge, not only did they beat us, and I personally do not like that, but it's like a slight against not only me personally, but a slight against like us as a people. I think that, that sort of similarity, I think is really interesting to, kind of think about, especially when we think about, Juneteenth.
That when it speaks to, like, I think Devon, I don't know if you see this, but it kind of speaks to that resistance in the Civil War to arming Black soldiers, or to even allowing Blacks to participate. This notion of that whites lose face in conflict with darker bodies where they lose. And so we just prevent it altogether here. We try to prevent it for as long as possible, but there is no denying that there is part of racism is
It's
that.
It's that respect. It's the respect, basically.
Yeah.
The loss to an inferior force.
Yes, their lack of respect, or their losing respect for you, and you maintaining your respect. Yeah.
What are some of the challenges that Black Americans today face today? And with that, what can the lessons that Juneteenth has taught us, not just, again, as Dr. Dunbar said, as, it's not a Black holiday, it's an American holiday. So what can the lessons of this, day really, help to try to solve or resolve these issues that we're starting to see today either come back up into play, as we've all spoken about so far, or, some of these other issues that are starting to become more predominantly seen as far as other ones, as Devin mentioned earlier, the housing crisis, as Dr. Dunbar mentioned, educational crisis, etc. So what are some of these challenges, and how can the Juneteenth lessons help us move towards resolving these issues and hopefully resolve them for not just our generation, but for future ones, since we're also talking about the future as well?
What I see is that there is just a complete lack of awareness of just how many Black people fought in the Civil War, sacrificed their lives. There's just a complete silence. And a lot of the issues, I think, really begin there, this lack of knowledge of our history. So if I say that there is a point where we are today, my concern is this effort to rewrite history, or at least to suppress it. That speaks to a bigger crisis in our society that I think Juneteenth, if we really stop and we embrace Juneteenth, that this holiday sort of unravels or those problems, that the fact of the Black reality in America, the fact of Black existence in America, and the longevity of that, and the fact of the Black presence that makes America what America is. these are all encapsulated in Juneteenth. So long as we celebrate Juneteenth, I think that this fight, this effort to deny the real history cannot succeed. And so in a way, I think that Juneteenth, celebrating it, really learning about it, it's a way to keep history factual, to ensure that we recognize that we are all a part of this great experiment, and that the Black community, African Americans, history, African Americans are a central part of American history, and that the African American experience is American history. American history is not beautiful. Nobody's history is beautiful. But Juneteenth shows us that we can overcome, that something just, that we really can, that even if it comes out of a cynical place, nonetheless, the legal transformation, you know, what is put in place is extremely important, and it makes our community, it makes our society a much more justice. I say and I see that for me, the fact of Juneteenth, the fact that this conversation, it kind of creates the space for all kinds of other civil liberties to emerge for women, you know, back to the civil rights movement, for LGBTIQA+ community, that for Asian Americans, for that Juneteenth is kind of like a catalyst for transformation.
It should be used as an example. I wouldn't doubt it if there are privileged individuals who have grown up from like hereditary wealth, or who are in the upper middle class division of society at this point, where they would see, or they have a lack of recognition of Juneteenth as a holiday, where they might scoff or not care. I mean, I'm talking mostly like individuals who are probably white. But again, drawing back to the universal equality aspect to it, the consequences of getting to that point was due to the sacrifice of African Americans, but also hundreds of thousands of white Americans as well, and people who in modern day just think of it as I don't know, maybe more of a liberal holiday, have just the need to really expand on the educational prowess of knowledge of this holiday and the history overall, will open the eye. I think we'll probably at least deviate away from certain bigotry and ideals that lean that way, because again, the sacrifice, the American experience here encapsulated both African Americans and, again, hundreds of thousands of white Americans. So including women as well in the Civil War, who served as nurses on the battlegrounds and were literally intense amputating people. So,
and we're not, we haven't, of course, mentioned the indigenous First people.
Of course.
That's
of course.
a different, you know, sadly, this conversation kind of takes place on top of them.
I mean, yeah, just want to agree with, you know, both Devin and Joyce. I hope that, you know, with Juneteenth and actually having it be a federal holiday, I think the importance again of, you know, history is written by the victors. Victors to who? That's what I ask. And I hope that, you know, with Juneteenth and its influence, like in the future, I hope going forward that we realize that Black history is American history. Indigenous history is, you know, American history. The history of Asian immigrants, Latino immigrants is American history. Like I said, I just hope going forward, you know, that we understand that, you know, having the US and how we teach history as much more inclusive and accurate. So, yeah.
I think that ties in perfectly to what Dr. Dunbar said. Like, I think my favorite quote, or one of my favorite quotes of this conversation, that as long as we keep on celebrating Juneteenth, then the missions of those who try to, you know, repel like actual history being taught those will continue to be defeated if we keep on celebrating Juneteenth. So I think those 2 points are just perfect to kind of collide with one another and also kind of start to, really to include this conversation that we've had today. But hopefully this inspires those who are listening to this to continue this conversation else. I think that's the perfect kind of endpoint to this conversation for now, at least. So thank all of you for being here today, especially thank you, Dr. Dunbar, as well, for making time out of your day to be with us at ONC. I really appreciate that. This has been Allow Us to Explain. Thank you all so much for listening in. Tune in next week as we talk about animal testing in the U.S. So until then, have a great rest of your day.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.